Good morning. Now, Mr. Connell, our witness today is Professor Brown.
That is correct.
Morning.
Please sit down, Professor. Good morning.
Thank you.
Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who's sitting opposite. But first, I understand you've agreed to take the oath.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, can I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, you're scheduled for the whole of today. Whether your evidence takes that time, we'll just have to see. We will probably break for coffee at about 11:30 and then break for lunch at 1 o'clock. If, on the other hand, you wish to take a break at any stage, give me an indication and we'll take a break. Now, Mr. Connell.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Right, let me start with the formal question that everybody gets, which is you have prepared a witness statement for the purposes of this inquiry. Are you content to adopt that statement as part of your evidence?
Well, there are actually two things in the statement that I picked up when I was reviewing and doing my preparation for today's hearing. The first one's a fairly simple one, that in page 24, paragraph 101, the actual heading is missing there. It should say performance escalation framework as a heading. It makes the statement flow a bit better.
Sorry, Professor, can you just give me that again?
Page 24, paragraph 101.
Right.
Yep.
I wonder if we're working on the same
It'll
document.
be, I was about to say to you, Professor, that we will use your statement as a guide to work through a number of the issues. And at the top of each page, when it comes up on the screen in front of you, will find an electronic page number which matches the way this has been filed as things are now done electronically. Now, paragraph number 101 you were talking about, is that right?
Paragraph 101 should have a heading, the performance escalation framework, to separate it from the previous part, which was the duty of candour questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The second thing, and more importantly, really, page 22, paragraph 93. When I wrote the statement, at that point, I had no recollection of receiving a letter from Dr. Redding about a stage 3 whistleblower, and I hadn't been able to find any correspondence in the files that I had access to. As part of my preparation, I did actually find it. So I did receive a letter from Dr. Redding, and I did reply to that.
I've made a note of both of these, and we'll no doubt pass both of them on our way through the statement. Just to keep the formalities correct, subject to the corrections you've just now made, are you content to adopt the witness statement as part of your evidence?
I am.
Thank you. Now, before I turn to the questions I'd like to ask, can I just mention something we've also mentioned, a number of other witnesses, that clearly, as we are approaching the end of the oral evidence in this inquiry, we are actively listening for any points that might emerge which would assist in recommendations for the future or the like. So if at any point either I ask you about that or you want to volunteer something about that, please just indicate and we'll take what you can offer. Now, let's just put the witness statement up, if you don't mind. So as you'll see, we start at, for our purposes, at page 3, simply because we have an electronic bundle of these things. But the paragraph numbers, you'll be glad to know, remain unchanged from your You obviously have a hard copy statement in front of you, do you?
I do.
Well, it'll come up on the screen in any event. If at any point you're not sure where I'm pointing to, then just indicate. Just to get the detail first, am I right in understanding that you became a non-executive board director in January of 2015 and then chairman in December of that year?
That's correct.
And you remained as chair until November 2023?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, you explain on the first page that some of the questions that you may have been asked you didn't think were within your technical knowledge, and others may have been dealt with by the corporate management team. Just perhaps early in this process, the word governance is a word that appears frequently in your witness statement for reasons which will become apparent. One of the areas that we have in a way been investigating might be described as the governance of the building project, and whether that was successful, adequate, or whatever. Is governance in the context of an organisation like NHS GDC an important matter?
Absolutely.
And why is that? Just help me understand that as a backdrop to what we're going to talk about.
Well, I think all organisations, to successfully deliver the outcomes that are expected of them, have to be very good at the day-to-day operations and very good at the delivery, very good at management in effect. They also have to be very good at change. They have to be very good at moving things forward and ensuring things don't stand still. Leadership is how I would describe that. But the management of the day-to-day operation and the implementation of change have to be taken forward in a manner which is aligned and a manner which produces the right outcomes. And governance is there to ensure that those two functions actually operate the way they're intended to. So governance really has 5 functions in itself. One is to ensure that the direction of the organisation has been set in a way that will deliver the outcomes.
Okay.
Governance is also
just
about holding to account.
I'm sorry to interrupt your answer. I'll let you give it again just a moment. If you're going to give us 5 points here, I know his lordship will want to get the gist of these 5 points into his notes. So if you could just go a little bit more slowly through the 5, that'd be very helpful. I'm sorry, I did interrupt number 1.
So the governance function really starts with setting the direction of the organisation. You could summarise governance as the direction and control of the organisation, if you wanted to keep it a very short statement. But within that, there's clearly 5 functions. And the first one is the setting the direction of the organisation to ensure that it can deliver the outcomes. And that, in the context of the NHS, is primarily set by government. And the function of the NHS board is to ensure that that direction is delivered. So that's really the second function of governance, which is holding to account the managers and the leaders in the organisation who are responsible for the day-to-day delivery of the services and responsible for ensuring that those services change to meet the changing demands of the environment that they operate in. I think governance is also partly about ensuring that the stakeholders in the organisation are properly engaged with. And obviously within the NHS, that's primarily the patients, and then the staff, and of course the government is a key stakeholder in the organisation as well. But governance is also about risk and risk management, and that's a key function of the governance system. And then finally, it's a function of governance to set the culture of the organisation, to set the expectations of what the organisation's culture should be. Now, I see all of this having spent a considerable amount of time researching governance and actually developing the policy document for the governance of the NHS in Scotland. And for a number of years, I chaired the Corporate Governance Steering Group for the NHS in Scotland. So I've got a very clear view in my own head of what governance is, where it sits alongside management and where it sits alongside leadership. And those three things have to come together for an organisation to be successful.
Can I ask you two things about that? We'll come back to touch on a number of these topics, no doubt, in passing through the event. One is that you mentioned culture. Now, if you have an organisation in which the culture is not what you want, does that make the governance system more difficult to operate?
If you get an organisation where the culture's not what you want, it makes the management of the service delivery more difficult, and it makes the leadership of change more difficult as well. So it definitely impacts on the outcomes that the organisation can deliver. So it is a responsibility of those people accountable for the governance system to ensure that culture is something that's addressed.
The other point I just wanted to ask you was that we had some evidence that suggests that in a system where there are different layers of responsibility and different either persons or groups at different levels, an organisation might have a system in place in which level 2 doesn't know there's an issue unless level 1 issues what was described as an exception report. And level 2 doesn't know, it never goes any further because obviously something further up the system doesn't know either. Now, a structure based on reliance on exception reports, would that struggle to meet what you would expect?
I think an organisation of a certain size which has a tiered management structure, which obviously the NHS is, has tiered decision making, and therefore it has tiered governance. So you have to have a system in place where you have an assurance framework that has, as you describe it, processes and procedures in place to escalate issues to the next level. But it also has to have an active approach to governance where each level is taking its assurance from more than one source. So from looking at reports that are given from the next level, you also have to look at external reports, you have to look at what the data's telling you, but you also have to have an interaction with the staff and the managers at the different levels. So from a board perspective, it's important that you have an interaction with the frontline staff. It's important that you have different sources of information, for example, from the clinicians as well as from the managers. It's important that you're able to compare the data in your organisation to other similar organisations. Obviously, other health boards would be the best comparator for a health board. And it's important that you're able to work with the commissioners, in this case the government, to take their opinion as well. So you don't just rely on one source for assurance, and you don't be assured by another part of the organisation. You take your own assurance from the information that you gather.
And you've used the expression "you." That would apply to the board of a health board?
Absolutely, they apply at every level though. When I say you, I'm speaking of a person within an organisation who has governance responsibility.
Right, so it applies to individuals.
Yes.
And it applies
Yes.
to
Applies to individuals,
group
applies
of
collectively.
individuals who make up a board.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Professor Brown. I'm going to come back to your governance paper just in a moment, at least briefly. We're not going to read the whole of it for obvious reasons. Can we just go to page 4 of your witness statement? So that's electronic page 4. You were in place as a non-exec around about the time that the new hospital, and I'll just call it the new hospital collectively, was handed over, and in the period immediately thereafter, when they were moving towards patient migration, and then immediately thereafter that. Now, you were not, you say in your paragraph 7, you were not playing any part in commissioning or handover. As a non-executive member of the board, were you hearing about any issues that were arising in 2015 before you became chair?
No. I think I had attended 2 meetings of the board during that period, and 1 seminar where there was a presentation on the opening of the new hospital from the programme director, Dr. Stewart. And at that point, I was certainly not aware of any concerns or issues that had been identified with the construction of the hospital. And there was no discussion at that point around risks that could emerge from such a large project.
And one of the issues that this inquiry's heard quite a lot about was the challenges faced by the estates team when the hospital was handed over, which led them to be, these were toiling considerably to get half the stuff done they needed to get done. They claimed they were understaffed, and that was not just people at ground level, but this was escalated to various levels of management. Now, did you come to hear any of that?
No.
Did you ever come to hear about that issue?
It surfaced as part of some of the reviews that had been taken by the time I was the chair, and we were looking as a board to understand better how we found ourselves in this position. So I'm aware of the points that you've made, but I wasn't aware of them at the time. I was a non-executive board member.
No. You know, I'm just...
Right, you distinguished the period when you were a non-executive board member from the time that you were chairman of the board.
Yes.
Right, okay.
The reason I wanted to ask that was that obviously one of the questions about governance that might emerge is that had knowledge of these issues been, let's me just use the word escalated, earlier than when you were having a retrospective review of problems, then would you agree that would have potentially assisted?
I would agree, because I would have expected action would have been taken earlier to support the team.
Now, if we move on to the next page of your witness statement and we go to a section headed NHS GGC Board and Governance, you there reference a document from the Scottish Government, a blueprint for good governance. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
We might just get that on screen for a moment. That'll be Bundle 52, Volume 1 at page 194. So that's just the front cover. This is the document we're talking about. So this is a document, I think, that post-dates many of the events that we're concerning with, but you were involved as a co-author, is that Right.
That's the second edition of it.
Right.
There was an early edition that I was the co-author of. I was the author of the second edition.
Right, so just so I've got that, you're the sole author of the second edition.
Yes.
Thank you.
I should emphasise, though, that it does represent a large piece of work that involved a large number of contributions from people across both national and local government.
And what's in short terms, what's the purpose of this document?
The history of it goes back to when I was approached by Siobhan Robinson when she was Cabinet Secretary and Paul Gray's Director General, along with Susan Walsh, who was one of the non-executives in Healthcare Improvement Scotland, to undertake a review of governance in NHS Highland. And when Susan and I looked at the request, our first conversation with the Director General was, what would you measure good governance in NHS in Scotland against? Because there was a lack of clear guidance as to what is meant by governance, what good governance was look like, what the individual roles and responsibilities would be. So as part of that review, the government commissioned from Susan and I to effectively write the guidance. And that's what the first version was. We were asked to ensure that it was something that was readily accessible to board members because it was aimed at board members who came from a wide range of backgrounds and who would have different understandings and experience of governance. We were asked not to make it a instruction manual. So the first version, which Susan and I wrote over a period of almost a year, because we researched both private and public sector. We researched healthcare governance both in Scotland and in other countries, including NHS England. We produced the first document, which was a high-level document, and boards were asked then to adopt that and adapt that to their own particular circumstances. At the same time, it was decided to set up a steering group to support them to do that. And I was asked to chair that steering group. The steering group was made up of health board chairs, chief executives, board secretaries, and a variety of people from Scottish Government. And we then helped the boards to adapt and adopt the blueprint for good governance. And as we were doing that, it became clear that boards were asking for more guidance. They felt the original document was too high level and didn't give them enough detail on how they would do it. It said why we needed good governance and what good governance looked like, but what they were wanting was more advice on how to introduce that. So the Corporate Governance Steering Group worked for some time to actually look at how we would do that. And this document, the second version of it, is in effect that responds to that request. And that was then introduced in 2022.
Now, I only want to look at this very briefly because obviously we have the document and it covers a lot of ground. Can we just look briefly at page 199? I just wanted to put that up because I was interested in 2.6 because it uses that phrase "hold to account," where you've got it. According to this, board members should hold their executive leadership teams to account. Now, what we've had this phrase used by various people. Well, X happened, somebody would be held to account. What does it mean?
Well, firstly, it means that their performance is measured. Now, that's the performance of the organisation and the part of the organisation they're responsible for. And secondly, their own individual performance through the performance management system. Secondly, it means that there is ongoing discussions on the issues, the risks, the challenges that are being faced. So it's not just a backward look on what they've actually delivered, but it's also a discussion around what is taking place about things that may possibly arise, the risks in the organisation. It does ultimately impact for the staff through the performance management system. It impacts on their pay, can impact on their careers, and for some people it can impact on their employment.
The other paragraph I'd noted just in passing, page 201. I just picked this up because there was an attempt to define governance in healthcare in Scotland in a single paragraph. And we see that in 3.7.
Yeah.
I was interested in two things about that. One, it's the ability to ask questions, which would tie in with the answer you've just given, I think, that you have to question. And the other thing, it is to be distinguished from executive-led operational management. Explain the distinction between governance as defined and operational management. Because you've just talked about challenging impact on people's pay and jobs and so on.
Management is about decision-making on the here and now, on the day-to-day delivery of the services, the allocation of resources, the distribution of staff, the processes, the technology, the infrastructure, on the day-to-day current organisation. Governance, as I've explained to you, is setting the direction of the organisation and then holding the management to account for that delivery. So management is very much about the day-to-day delivery of the services. It's the decisions around the complexity of allocating resources, training, all the day-to-day decisions that have to be made.
Thank you. I think I'll be able to move on a bit now, but I wanted to ask you one question, going back to your witness statement at page 6, about the structures that were in place in NHS GGC. We've been given to understand that there was one particular, I may be using the wrong label, but subcommittee, I think called the Performance Management Group, something like that, which actually seemed to do a lot of the heavy lifting, whereas the board was a group that met so many times a year in public. The Performance Management Group, it might be suggested, actually did most of the key discussions. Would you agree with that?
No.
And why not?
Because there were a number of committees that sat underneath the board, and each of them had a specific delegated role and responsibility. I think if you're referring to Finance and Performance Management Committee, had a specific role looking at the allocation of resources, looking at the expenditure and where we were, and looking at that in relation to not only what was being spent, but what was being achieved. It was also a committee where we were able to look across the 6 health and social care partnerships performance alongside the performance of the acute services from a healthcare perspective. But we had a clinical and care governance committee that would look in depth at the quality of care that was being delivered, and that would include areas such as infection prevention and control. There's an audit and risk committee, which certainly looked at the risks in the organisation and how we were bringing together the risks that were being managed by the individual committees as a whole. There's a staff governance committee that was looking at all the people issues. So each of those committees, and I think there's 10 committees in total, won't go through them all unless you would like me to. Each of those committees then would report into the board, and the board meetings actually went through each of their issues, each of their risks, and the board committee then the board itself put that together in an overarching view of what the healthcare system was actually delivering across Greater Glasgow and Clyde. Yeah. I mean, the board, if you obviously have looked at the board papers and the board agendas, they're very comprehensive, and the board meetings themselves took quite a considerable amount of time. Now, in addition to having a board meeting every second month, we also had board seminars in the months that we didn't have a board meeting, which gave us the opportunity to ensure that board members were fully briefed on anything that was new, any changes that were coming from Scottish Government, changes in the legislation and so on.
I wanted to ask you something then, since you mentioned committees, that one of the features that's cropped up during the inquiry when we've looked at an assortment of committees at different levels is that it's been at least suggested a large number of the committees didn't ever seem to do anything. That what would happen is that they would sit, they would receive reports, there would be a brief discussion, so-and-so reported on such and such, and somebody would say noted, and they would move on, but most of them didn't seem to actually take any action themselves. Now, is that a feature you recognise as being correct for NHS GGC?
Well, I think if you're reading the minutes of these committees, and that's the only thing you're basing your view in the committee on, then I can see why you would think that reports were presented and simply noted and moved on, because you wouldn't be aware of the questions and the discussions that actually happened. The approach to recording what happens in the committees is based on a very straightforward, it's a UK Government Cabinet Office guidance on minute taking of listing the topic that was discussed, any decisions that were made, any actions that were requested. So papers would come for awareness, papers would come for approval, but they weren't all resulting in decisions being made or actions coming out of them. But every committee would be making decisions, either approving things or not approving them. Every committee would have actions that would be coming out of them, and every committee had an action log. Yeah. And the board would then receive these minutes, and at each board meeting, the chair of the committee would be invited to bring to the attention of the board any issues that they felt the board needed more information on, and the board was invited to ask any questions of the committee chair. Given the number of committees and the fact that we had 6 health and social care partnerships, that took up a large part of the board meeting.
I think the point I was probably trying to put to you was that what we saw didn't seem to indicate there was much by way of actions at the instance of the committees. There may have been discussions, there may have been fuller discussions than the minutes might indicate, but didn't often seem that the committees took any action in the sense of saying, do this or that's unacceptable or whatever the action might be. But you say that simply might not be evident.
Well, I think the action logs for each of the committees would give you the evidence of that.
Let me ask you a completely different question that's been suggested to me. Obviously, we're looking at all kinds of possible issues here. One of the questions which might crop up is that a lot of people who seem to have featured in events, well, obviously we've been looking at events over quite a number of years, seem to be people who had no clinical responsibilities, whatever their original training might have been by the time they were involved in managerial roles. And one of the questions that's been suggested to me is whether you think it might be a good idea to ensure that managers are usually clinicians who retain an element of clinical role, so they don't simply sit in a management role and decide X, but they actually also see what happens to those decisions in practice. You any view on that?
I think there are some senior managers who come from a clinical background but are not practicing as clinicians. And there are some senior managers from a clinical background who still practice as clinicians. I think that healthcare organisations should be clinically led. I think that whilst the direction for the organisation is set by government and government policy, I think the design of the organisation should be led by the clinicians, because they understand both the patient needs and they understand the science and the medicine that can be delivered with it. I think it's very important that clinicians have a role in the management of the organisation. I think they also have to be supported and partnered and facilitated by experienced managers who are skilled in management, with leaders who are skilled in change management. And you have to have people in the organisation who have governance skills as well. So it's a multidisciplinary approach.
But it should be clinically led, in your
Yes, clinically led and managerial enabled.
Now, can I ask you another thing about governance structures, because it's cropped up quite a lot in evidence from others. In an organisation such as NHS GGC, because obviously that's the one we're looking at, and let me just say, obviously we appreciate that that's a much bigger organisation dealing with lots of other issues with which this inquiry is not concerned. But from what we've been looking at, one of the key relationships that's been suggested is the relationship between the chief executive and the chair. Would you agree that that's an important relationship?
Absolutely.
Because the chief executive may be the decision maker in many cases and may also control the information in many cases. And the chair may control the degree to which the chief executive is challenged. Are these both correct assumptions?
Yes.
So if the chair doesn't challenge the chief executive, if there's a lax or cozy or with any other relationship, could that be quite a problem?
I think it could be, yes.
But part of my reason for asking this is that the evidence we had from Mr. Wright from his former position in government, which perhaps came as a surprise to many people, was that the NHS chief executive didn't manage board chief executives. They were accountable to the chair rather than to him as NHS chief executive, and it was the chairs that held the chief executives to account. I take it you agree that that's the position.
I don't think that's actually what he said. I mean, I did see Malcolm's evidence, and he made it very plain that the chief executive is accountable to the board as the chief executive, but is also accountable to the Director General. He's also Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, through the accountable officer system. So the chief executive has dual accountability.
The other question I wanted to ask you about that was that another question that has cropped up, but inevitably because you're coming relatively late in our list, just the way it's worked, lots of things have cropped up, is what responsibility the chief executive actually has. I want to ask you this question against a particular background just to see what your reaction to it is. In the private sector, it's not uncommon to find chief executives either being fired or resigning if something has gone wrong, even if they are not physically responsible or personally responsible, because that's the way that world often operates. The buck stops in their desk. If something's gone wrong, they're gone. Now, the impression we may have been given by at least one other witness is that kind of idea of the chief executive ultimately being responsible for everything is not accepted in the NHS. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think that is the case. And I think if you look at the recent history in NHS Scotland, if you look at other health boards where chief executives have gone, they have been held accountable as the person responsible. So I don't know really where that idea comes that chief executives aren't responsible from at all. I mean, go back to Malcolm Wright, and Malcolm referred to when he was put in to a health board when the chief executive had gone. That was NHS Tayside. I was put in as the chair for the same reason. The chair had resigned. So there is a history within the NHS in Scotland of senior leaders leaving their posts.
We asked Mr. Calderwood, who was chief executive from the signing of the contract to build this very big project hospital. By any accounts, I think somebody said it took about half the budget of the NHS for a year. Very big flagship hospital, which, as it turned out, had a significant number of issues in it, some of which we'll touch on later. If ultimately he was responsible for that, and he didn't seem to assent to that proposition, would that surprise you?
Yes.
Right, let me
just pick up one point that,
of course,
the Queen Elizabeth at 842 million wouldn't have been half of the Scottish NHS budget, which at that point would be probably, I think, round about 12 billion.
Thank you. I'm happy to take that correction from you. Fault is no doubt mine. Let's move on let's go to page 9. Now, I know you're not primarily involved in the whistleblowing processes, but I wanted to ask you one thing about whistleblowing, because it has come up with a whole range of different witnesses, and I know you had a review done of what the policy provided. But going back to the question of attitudes and culture, we've had a fair amount of evidence from pretty senior managers that their view is, I'm trying to think how to word this very carefully, that people should follow the appropriate processes, and that's what should be stressed, and that therefore the consequences, they're not really encouraging of whistleblowing as an exercise. Now, we've had lots of evidence about whistleblowing. We have a very learned report on it. by Sir Robert Francis. This kind of approach to whistleblowing, this idea, if you're asked about it, your immediate answer is people should follow the due processes through their line management. Is that something you encountered when you were chairman?
I can't think of a particular example when I was chairman that I could say I had encountered that. But I do believe that it's very important that the organisation sees whistleblowing as a good thing, that sees whistleblowing as a necessary thing, and sees whistleblowing as something that should be supported. I think you would normally expect staff, managers, if they've got concerns, to take them through the usual management processes, usual management meetings and so on. But if that doesn't produce the outcome that the individual's looking for, then whistleblowing's there. But I also think whistleblowing's there for people who don't feel confident for whatever reason to go through the management chain, if I can describe it as that. So I think it's very important it's there. That was why we did the review, because we were concerned that, as you've described, people have said that they don't have confidence in the whistleblowing process, or they didn't think the whistleblowing process was something that people were being encouraged to use. And that was why I asked Charles Vincent to undertake his review.
Yeah,
Right, we're talking about another review. Or maybe you want to
I think
explore that.
I think the witness is talking about the review instructed on the part of Mr. Vincent into the whistleblowing policies of NHS GGC. As I understand it, that's what you're referring to.
Tom, but it wasn't just into the effectiveness of the policies, but it was also about whether the organisation was utilising those policies.
But I think the point I wanted to make sure I was getting clear with you is that you can have some very nice policies. They can be beautifully written. They can be appropriately circulated. Everybody can sign a form saying they've read them. But if there is a culture which says the right thing to do is to go through process, then you wouldn't get an organisation, would you, that is welcoming, encouraging, regarding whistleblowing as a good thing. Would you agree?
I think it depends whether you're saying that you should go through the right process, full stop, or whether you're saying that the right process is the wrong language. I think you should go through the straightforward management process first. If you're saying that and you're saying that's it, full stop, I think that would discourage people to whistleblow. But if what you're saying is that you should go through the management process first, if you're comfortable with that, and if having gone through the management process, you still have concerns, then the whistleblowing processes are there to support you to take those concerns further. So I think it's the extent of the message that's out there. Now, that's the message that was sent. Now, whether that's the message that was received, that's another question.
Well,
Sorry, just can I clarify? When you say that was the message sent, what do you mean by that?
Well, that's the message that was put out through the management line. That was the message that was put through the publications on the staff internet. That was the message, if you like, that came from the top of the office.
And that message would include the idea, if I've noted you correctly, that what you describe as the usual management processes are available for those who are comfortable with them, but and this is how I noted you, whistleblowing should be there for people who are not confident with the management processes. And what I'm taking from that evidence is that you would accept that having gone through what you describe as the usual management processes should not be seen as a threshold criterion for consideration of a whistleblower, and that that was the message that the board at least attempted to put out to staff through, you give the example of the staff intranet.
Yes.
Yes.
And if I could just add, I think that's very important, because if the concern is about the management, to expect staff to go through the management process to raise these concerns, I would say is unreasonable.
Mr. Connell.
Thank you. Oh, actually, a related question. We'll just turn on to page 10 of your witness statement, just to see if I can understand what you did or did not know. One of the issues that's been raised here is the suggestion that some people, particularly IPC doctors, were raising concerns about the environment of the hospital, water, ventilation, and so on, from very early on in the hospital's existence. Were you aware of that?
I think when are we talking about, when I took over as chair or as a non-exec before that?
Well, either. If you can just tell me what your awareness of that issue was, if any.
As a non-exec, before I became the chairman, I wasn't aware of that as an issue. When I became the chairman, I became aware from conversations with Robert Calderwood when he was the chief executive that there had been some concerns raised around infection prevention and control within the hospital. And as time went on, that conversation was firstly round about water, and then it was around ventilation.
The reason I wanted to ask you about it is that one of the arguments put forward by those who complain about how they were reacted to was that they were saying there are issues here that focused on the building, whether it's water or ventilation or both. And they're doing that from very early on, and they don't get very much of a response from, as you put it, the management. Were you aware of that concern?
Not until the point where there was the ESPA, when they had the discussions around specifically the lists of the issues that the microbiologists had brought to attention.
So there's perhaps 2 points there. When you talk about the SBAR, that's the SBAR in October 2017.
That would be right, yeah.
And as I say, there's maybe two aspects to that. First of all, that microbiologists were concerned about the state of the building. And secondly, that these concerns had been enunciated as early as 2015. Now, I think, Mr. Connell, you're exploring if and when Professor Brown became aware of these two aspects. In other words, concern about the building and the period when the concerns were first articulated.
Well, I'm exploring that, my Lord. I'm obliged to my Lord for reminding us that the SBAR was in 2017, because that gives a date to Professor Brown's response. I have a follow-up question to that is, which goes from page 10. If you look at paragraph 33, at the point you're writing the statement, you're saying that you're unable to confirm an exact date when you first became aware of the concerns and issues around the hospital environment. And you say there it would have been in 2016. And you, I think, cite informal discussions with Mr. Calderwood. So is that your first intimation and then nothing much more until 2017, or how did it work?
The initial, around 2016, my recollection is the discussions were around that there were infections that were having to be managed, and there was suggestions that these could be related to the hospital environment, and that was being investigated. No? It wasn't until 2017 that became a much more specific concern about the extent that this was a bigger issue than the normal, I suppose, number of infections that are in any hospital environment, and the difficulties of trying to understand sometimes the cause of the infection.
I just wanted to get clear when you first understood that there were concerns that the hospital environment may have been a problem, whether it's water or ventilation. When did you first know about that?
I must admit, there's always concerns with any infection.
Of course.
The hospital environment in any hospital is the issue. The question, I think, is at what point was it becoming apparent that the Queen Elizabeth, the quality of the build was such that this was a significant problem that was more than just an individual infection in a particular ward at a particular time. Yeah?
Right.
And I think that started to become apparent as we moved through into 2017. But I couldn't put an actual date. There wasn't a light bulb moment for me or for the board for that matter. We said we have a major issue here. I couldn't put the actual date on that. This grew over time.
Have you moved from the whistleblowing point? Because it's no doubt my fault. I'm not quite sure if we're talking about Professor Brown's awareness of the fact that the microbiologists had raised questions about the environment, perhaps as early as 2015. And these were the same concerns being articulated in the SBAR in October 2017. So, as I say, it's entirely my fault, but are we exploring when Professor Brown became aware of that timing disparity?
Well,
or are we exploring his more general knowledge that there was question marks arising out of incidents of infection and possible connection with the building?
I think, it's not for me to say, but I think Professor Brown has just answered the latter question. He's explained when he said there's no single light bulb moment, but it was only in 2017 did we get the understanding that there may be an issue with the build of the Queen Elizabeth. I think His Lordship has prompted me to go back to the earlier part of that question, because one of the issues is not just when did you generally come to the idea that there might be an issue here, which you've timed to somewhere around 2017, no specific date for the reasons you explained, but also when did you become aware that at least some microbiologists had been basically banging that drum on and off since 2015. Because that's quite a long time given the topic, is it not? And can you help us with when you learned that that's the case?
Certainly I would have been aware that microbiologists were working on infection management teams and looking for the solutions. I became aware that they were dissatisfied with the support that they'd been given, or dissatisfied with the pace of response at the point of the 2017 discussions.
I'll move on to another topic. Page 11, DMA Canyon. So you know where we're going here. I understand from paragraph 35 of your witness statement, your first knowledge, particularly of, let's focus on the 2015 report, was when you were told about it by the chief executive at some point prior to Dr. Armstrong making board members aware. Do you know when that was, when you first heard about it?
It was when the chief executive was made aware of it by Tom Steele when he was in HPS. And as part of the review that he was carrying out, he'd asked to see, these are standard reports that should appear when you're doing this sort of construction. He'd asked to see them, and when he got them, he realised that they hadn't been actioned. He brought that to Jane Grant's attention, and she brought that to mine, and then it was taken to the board just after that.
Your understanding is that they came to light because Professor Steele requested to see them.
It's my understanding it was part of the review that he'd done.
In paragraph 34, you tell us that Dr. Armstrong made board members aware of the DMA Canyon reports. I'm focusing on 2015 primarily for obvious reasons. Did she tell you whether she'd read them?
I can't recall whether she said she'd read them or not, but I would assume that she must have read them to be able to present the findings.
Now, the kind of follow-up to this I wanted to ask you about, one can understand that there was a question as to why somebody within the Estates Department didn't do what the report said. But from a governance perspective, did the emergence of a report dating back to 2015, which hadn't been followed up, just to use that word, not raise questions as to the structures above estate, the individual estates officers, as to why this hadn't been spotted earlier?
It did, and those questions were asked by the board.
And did you get an answer?
The answer at that point was they couldn't explain it because the individuals involved were no longer with Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and as a result of that, they then commissioned a further review by Professor Steele to look at the structures, the resources, and to look at the governance within the Estates Department, and to confirm there were no other reports that hadn't surfaced when they should have.
The reason I ask that is that on the face of it, we've heard from, I'll start my question again. We've heard from a number of witnesses that water and water safety is an important matter for a hospital of this kind. Would you agree?
Absolutely, for all hospitals.
Indeed. And therefore, there ought to be a governance system which at various levels is aware of the need for a report of this kind. Would you agree?
Yes.
Now, it's fine to say well, we made some investigations and some of the people weren't there, but presumably you were able to find out, who knew, who should have known, what committee should have known about it, what committee should have pursued it. Did you get that information?
My understanding is the governance system was there, but the individuals who had responsibilities for taking the actions hadn't taken the actions, and it's still not clear to me, certainly, why that happened, why that wasn't picked up further up within the governance system. I don't have an answer to that either, because an answer was never given to the board as to why that had happened.
I think you understand the part of the reason for my asking you that is that we've spoken to a number of the people further down the structure who were involved, and who did or didn't do things with the report. But I was just interested in what the board had found out about structures above that. And the answer is you didn't really get a proper answer.
No, we didn't.
And was it in the course of these investigations that you became aware of issues about staffing and pressure of work and so on?
Yes.
Now, once you became aware of these issues as a board, and you yourself as a chair, first of all, did it concern you to hear? Because I suspect you heard stories of people overworked, understaffed, couldn't get things done. Just to paraphrase, is that correct?
Yes, and it was of great concern to the board that the resource hadn't been in place to deal with any issues that come up as part of the handover. And as a result of that, then this important report hadn't been actioned, and then the same again in 2017.
Well, I can understand that Professor Steele may have reviewed the structures and systems and checked to see it shouldn't happen again, but did you find out why that unsatisfactory situation had been allowed to exist?
No. We were never given an explanation because, as I said, the individuals that had been responsible for that were no longer there. I mean, ultimately, responsibility for ensuring that the water safety system was operating would rest with the Director of Facilities, and he had since left. I would presume he would be better placed to answer these questions.
I think at the moment I'm trying to understand what the board did or didn't know, and what the board did or did not discover. It may sound slightly odd to those listening to this that the board was unable to find out why a situation of understaffing, under-resourcing was allowed to continue with some of the consequences possibly that we've heard about.
From the board's perspective, we were looking to find out what had happened, why it happened, what was necessary to put it right, and what was necessary to avoid it happening again. So we knew what had happened, but we couldn't get to the bottom of why it happened. So we made sure that Professor Steele took steps to ensure that it was no longer the situation and that it wouldn't happen again. It was not a satisfactory situation for the board.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you this particularly because later on the same page of your witness statement, you touch on a topic about horn taps, which the inquiry has had a lot of evidence about, where, reading it short, what had happened was a decision had been made during the construction process to continue to use horn taps, notwithstanding an issue that had been raised about safety following an incident in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. But that was, and this is my word, conditional on appropriate maintenance arrangements being put in place and implemented so as to ensure a safe system. Now, one of the concerns of many participating in this inquiry is how that situation arose. And a minor, at the lower level, somebody says, yeah, I was meant to do this and I never got round to it because I was doing 1,000 other things. And I'm paraphrasing, but did you presumably understand why not being able to find out why something as important as that was not done would be of concern to a lot of people here?
It was a concern to the board as well, but I'm not able to give an answer as to why these things occurred prior to the time that I was responsible and accountable as the board chair. We did ask the questions, the same questions you're asking as a board, but we're unable to get the answers because the people who had the answers were no longer available to us. And I do think that they're the people that should be answering these questions to the inquiry.
Yeah,
Well, you can proceed on the basis, Professor, that the inquiry has endeavoured to lead the witnesses who are available to it, who are able to give evidence. But I've noted what you say about the previous director of estates having retired, but were there not subordinate people in estates able to provide you with information? Mr. Parry, for example.
We were told that that information wasn't available to us.
Right.
let me ask the question one more time with a particular reference to it. Just sticking to the Horn Taps. We know DMA Canyon wasn't dealt with till 2018. Now, there was a thing later on that was generally called the water incident, when water suddenly became a big issue, and that started in 2018. Now, we're told that by the time of the water incident, the maintenance regime for Horn Taps hadn't been put in place. There was a special disinfection arrangement that was to be created, and it was still not done. Now, you must have had people available, in 2018 to explain to you why. Did you not?
The whole question around the maintenance, the technical details of what was required, all of that was presented to the board by this facilities director, and the board's focus was very much on what needed to be done to resolve the issue. But I don't have any clear recollection of explanations as to why things weren't done. It was more about what wasn't done and how that would then be remediated to ensure that the systems in place were to the appropriate standard.
Well, let's see if I can just finish this piece of narrative by looking at page 12 of your witness statement, where there's that we ought to deal with it because it's not been much discussed. Communication with an MSP, which touched on this topic. Now, that's dealt with in paragraph 40 of your witness statement. Can we see bundle 52, volume 1, page 96? Now, inevitably, we're going to get bits of an email chain which don't really matter. So there's obviously some discussion going on about wording here involving you, Sandra Bustillo, and Jane Grant about a letter to Monica Lennon, with Jane Grant saying she's changed it back to an original wording. Can we just move on? 97. So, do you remember being involved in the preparation of this letter?
I do.
It would appear from the header to this bundle of papers that the content was prepared among you, Sandra Bastillo and Jane Grant, is that right?
And the Scottish Government.
Now, if that's to do with DMA Canyon, or at least in part, where is that explained? Am I missing it somewhere? You can look at the second page if you like. The explanation is the part that starts in the first bullet point. The technical reports on the water supply were not reported by the external advisors to the board's senior leadership team. Now, just pausing there, that suggests that if it's DMA Canyon's fault for not reporting to the leadership team, which is not a suggestion that we've heard discussed so far, would you agree?
Sorry, which,
The first bullet point.
right.
The technical reports on the water supply were not reported by external advisors to the board's senior leadership team.
Well, I suppose it might depend exactly on what's.
Was that
how
intended to
read
refer to
that
DMA
bullet,
Canyon?
but the professor is in a position to help us with that.
I don't think his suggestion that DMA Canyon should have reported. I think it's simply stating the fact that it was not reported to senior leadership team, so it hadn't been reported by DMA Canyon. It hadn't been escalated, so the senior team didn't have that. You would have to see Monica Lennon's question about when and how did the senior leadership team come to know, to understand that's the response to it. At no point is anyone suggesting that DMA Canyon should have taken action.
I'm just wondering where we find any. Sorry, let me rephrase that question. Is there any point in the letter to the MSP in which you basically put your hands up and say, we haven't been able to find out why our systems at various levels did not spot this?
I don't think it does. It states the fact that what happened in response to it, but doesn't go into the detail of why.
I'm content to move on, my Lord. Happy if my Lord has other questions on this.
Just give me a moment. It's maybe not a fair question, Professor, but can you look at the paragraph below the bullets? The water supply was then reassessed by an independent authorizing engineer who described it, now it's presumably the water supply, as wholesome, which is the industry term to say that it is safe as defined in the regulations. This means the water in both the hospitals is safe. Does that second sentence actually follow from the first sentence?
I think it does.
Right. You would understand that the point being that if one was to take a certain reading, the fact that the point of supply from the public water supply is wholesome, doesn't necessarily tell us about the state of the all the water in the system.
I understand the point you're making. I think I would need to see the actual report from the authorising engineer to see what his definition of the water supply is. It to the point where
Fair
it
point.
arrives at the hospice, at the hospital, I should say, yeah, or is it the water supply within?
At the point
Which
of
is the point,
at
obviously,
the
you're
point
making.
of the tap.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, let's take that off the screen, thank you, and go back to the witness statement at page 12, where we find we're coming on to a different topic. Now, the Beatson BMT unit, Ward 4B issue has been much discussed for reasons you'll probably understand. Now, you say, well, you weren't involved in the decision in July, although you were on the board at the time. Is that correct? But
Yes.
that was during your period as non-executive director. Now, it's been suggested by a number of witnesses that a situation in which a leading unit like the Beatson BMT unit turns up at a brand new hospital, stays for a very short time and basically says, this is not good enough, we're going, is shocking, unprecedented, words of that kind. Would you agree?
I don't know whether it's unprecedented, but it is surprising.
I mean, it's surprising, quite a mild word for such a thing to take place in a brand new hospital. Would you agree?
I think you would be surprised if you relocated in those circumstances. You might also be shocked.
And what was your reaction?
I was certainly surprised and I was disappointed. Concerned.
Mm-hmm. And although they actually moved back in July, the issue continued for some considerable time. So it continued into your tenure as chair. I mean, can you remember what, if anything, you did to follow up on your concerns, surprise, shock, whatever it might be, as to how on earth you'd got into that situation?
Yes, I'd had the discussions with the chief executive, but I also went to the Beatson and visited the BMT unit and spoke to the consultants there and asked them how this had come about, what they thought the best solution to it was, and how keen were they to move back into the Queen Elizabeth.
Well, I can understand that they might be able to help you on a number of these topics, and we've heard from other witnesses that they were quite keen in principle to be in the Queen Elizabeth because of what we've described as the co-location issues with other services. But I mean, at least at first blush, a situation in which something like that happens suggests the need for some kind of pretty serious investigation to find an answer. Do you know if that happened?
Well, my understanding was we knew the answer, that it hadn't been properly specified what was required, and therefore it wasn't built to the requirement. And rather than have patients in a ward that we knew wasn't up to the standard, we returned them to where they had previously been until it was brought up to standard.
So who told you that it hadn't been properly specified?
That would be Robert Calderwood.
One of the pieces of evidence we've heard here is that when the move was originally proposed, which was a late move, 2013, Mr. Best signed a piece of paper about the move and understood that discussions would then take place about the details. And his then colleague, Mr. Jenkins, and a consultant and various others went and saw the project team and spelled out what they thought was to happen. Now, did you get any more detail as to, how what appears to be a pretty serious failing had taken place?
No, I didn't have that level of detail as to who made the decision or what the process was. All of that predated me, and I accepted that as it was a fact that we had this issue, and that the best resolution was to return the BMT unit to the Beatson until the problems in the Queen Elizabeth had been resolved.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that this conversation so far highlights that the approach that the board took, certainly in my time, was to resolve the issue. That was the priority. Priority was always the patient and giving the patients the best possible care in the best possible environment that we could create, and that whilst it was important to understand what had happened and why it had happened, it was more important to come up with the resolution and implement that as quickly as possible.
Well, I'm sure that it's a very creditable approach, Professor, and no doubt that was in your mind. But once the decision had been taken in July to take the patients back to the Beatson, they were back in the Beatson then for some considerable period of time. So it's not as if there was no time to find out. Were you aware of anyone else investigating this if you weren't pressing for it?
No.
Let's just look at the tailpiece to that, which is what then happened. Can we have bundle 27, volume 7, page 158, please? Now, this appears to be an options appraisal. Now, there's some debate as to whether the board ever saw this options appraisal, which was one prepared. Sorry, it runs under the name of Mr. Jenkins, but it was prepared by a group with specialist assistants on ranking risks and how to look at options and so on and so forth, including IPC and clinicians. Do you remember seeing this?
I think I was possibly at that Acute Services Committee meeting.
Can we just go on to the next page and the next one, please? This is, the paper goes on for some time, so I'm not going to ask you to read all of it. But what you have there is a sort of background narrative of the events that have happened. And then you see at the foot of that page a group representing clinical team, infection control, capital planning, estates and regional service management met twice to consider, report, and review options, and so on. We go on to the next page. There's a description of the current service, and then we go to options appraisal. So this was intended, as I understand it, to set out for decision a number of options as to what to do about the situation that had been encountered. So we go on to the next page. And essentially, we have there a summary of what is set out in much more detail later in the paper, if you just take that from me for ease of reference, where there are 8 options considered, numbers 4, 5, 7, and 8 are considered but not really followed through. So you're left with 4 options that this group is putting forward. One, stay where they are in the Beatson. And that was an issue because the co-location and other support services weren't available, just summarising. I'll just look at option 3, which was build another unit elsewhere in the new hospital. And 6 is also another new location. I just wanted to ask you about the second option, return to level 4 in the Queen Elizabeth. Because the point made there is unlikely to be a long-term option. That's the conclusion of this review. Now, we know that ultimately a decision was made on a balance to go back to the new hospital. However, assuming you saw that, did it concern you that you were being told that in this flagship hospital, the accommodation of the BMT unit was unlikely to be a long-term option because of the quality of the built environment?
It did. My understanding from memory is that that was on the basis that work had to be done to improve the environment.
But by that time you knew, did you not, that, for instance, achieving what Mr. Jenkins told us was 10 to 12 air changes, just to take that as an example, couldn't be done within the existing building, which is why options to build somewhere else were being looked at. I'm just trying to understand the response to that. I can understand you're surprised, you're concerned when this unit has to leave because things are not the way they want. Now you're in a situation where there's been a lot of investigation and people are still telling you this place is not suitable long term. Do you remember what discussion there was about that?
Not specifically from that meeting, but clearly by that time it had become very obvious that there were major issues to be addressed across the new hospital's campus, both the adult hospital and the children's hospital.
Thank you. Lord, I was going to go on to a new topic, so this might be an appropriate time. I just see the time has slipped past 11:30.
Professor Brown, as I said, we usually take coffee break about now. Can I ask you to be back for 5 to 12?
Yes. Thank you.
President.
Mr. Connell.
Right, well, can I just, first of all, pick up on the words with which you left us? When I was asking you about the BMT relocation and the information in the options appraisal indicating that, at least according to the group who prepared that options appraisal, moving back to the new hospital wasn't a long-term solution due to built environment. And you said something along the lines of, well, yes, I may have been concerned about that, but by that time we had a lot of other information about the state of the building. I'm paraphrasing what you said. Now, can you just explain to us what you meant by what you knew at that time about the state of the building?
Well, I think by 2017, it was clear there had been issues. I mean, the timeline would show that after it opened, the BMT was one of the first things that surfaced. But as we've already touched on this morning, there was issues around infections in the Children's Hospital. There'd been an HEI visit to the PICU. We had concerns about isolation rooms. It was all starting to build up into a picture that was suggesting this was more than a problem in a particular area of the hospital.
And I mean, I don't want to know about disputes with contractors in this environment for, in terms of detail. But getting that kind of information, would that not suggest to someone with governance as their topic that the governance arrangements which had been in place previously had not been effective?
Like you, I'm conscious of the fact that there is a legal case with the contractors there. But I think it would be fair to say that had there been effective governance in the construction process, then I would have expected there to have been fewer problems.
Now, can I just go back, if you don't mind, to a couple of things you touched on this morning?
Just to give me, just so I understand that last answer. Governance in which organisation? The contractor or the board's project team?
Integrated governance would require, good governance would require the governance systems to have been integrated across all three aspects of it, really. The construction, from the construction company, the oversight of that by the board's advisors and by NHSGC itself.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Cohen.
I was just going to go back, just so I've been asked just to make sure I'm getting your answers quite clearly. One of the topics we talked about was the DMA Canyon report, which relates to water safety. Do you know who the duty holder under Scottish Government guidance was under the regulations for water?
The duty holder is appointed, in my understanding, is that would be the Director of Facilities.
Well, if you take it from me, the duty holder under the 2014 SHTM 0401 was the Chief Executive. I'm just wondering whether, I mean, you've told us several times you've tried but failed to get to the bottom of why things had happened as it happened. Another thing I want to ask you about that. But would you not be able to identify even if you didn't know instantly, who persons were who held responsibility for the safety of the water system, and therefore what each level of responsibility ought to have done.
The organisation, the size, complexity of the organisation, the levels within the organisation, the detail within the management, the governance of it, is such that no, I couldn't have, as a board member or as the chair, been able to name precisely who was responsible for what at every level in the organisation. And clearly, I got it wrong when I thought it was the director of facilities that was
Well,
responsible for
I'm
the
not
water
suggesting.
and the chief executive.
Sorry, I'm not suggesting to you that you should have been able to say, yes, I know the structure is as follows: A, B, C, D, E, with different levels of responsibility at each level. I am suggesting, and that's the question I would like your comment on, that you might have been able to find that out had you been sufficiently determined to get to the bottom of this unsatisfactory situation.
Yes, I think that's a fair comment.
I've also been asked, at one point you said, well, part of the problem in investigating was that some of the people were not there. Now, does that not suggest that the governance of information, when people depart and arrive and move on, was not effective?
I would agree with that.
And I think I have you noted as saying that when you first heard of problems from Mr. Calderwood, you may have been concerned, but you didn't directly take any action at that time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. As far as I was concerned, the chief executive was taking the necessary action to take these things forward. That was his responsibility, and he would account to the board for what he was doing to resolve these issues.
Yeah, so it was your job to lead the board to make sure that the chief executive accounted to you for what was done on all of these issues. Is that fair?
It was my job to chair the board, and the chief executive was accountable to the board rather than to me as an individual. But I worked closely with the chief executives to ensure that that happened.
And from the answers we've had so far from you and from other witnesses, it doesn't sound as if getting to the bottom of all these problems adequately and reporting to the board ever happened. Would you agree?
I think it depends what we mean by getting to the bottom of it. We certainly identified what the problems were, and we identified what was necessary to resolve them, and then we put the steps in place to resolve them. Whether we spent enough time and energy trying to get an understanding of why they occurred, I think that's a fair criticism. That wasn't our priority, as I said earlier, to come to a conclusion as to why. We were interested in how we could then take that forward and resolve the issues.
And I think that cropped up in the context of the options appraisal when I suggested to you that it would be of concern to find, even after all the investigations that had taken place, that you're still being told going back to the Queen Elizabeth isn't a long-term solution. So you accept that getting to the bottom of why that was perhaps wasn't taken forward in the way it should have been.
Yes, I would accept that. I mean, we were looking as to what had to be resolved, what the problem was, rather than why had it occurred.
Okay.
It has to be, just to be clear, very much the attitude of the board, and the chief executive, and this corporate management team was to look, we saw ourselves as solving the problem that we had, that we were being faced with, and it was a problem that kept changing. There were new problems, different solutions. There were different opinions coming as to what was causing it. So we were concentrating very much on how do we make this hospital the best possible environment for our patients. As you point out, perhaps we should have been spending some more time looking as to why had it happened in the first place.
But the reason I wanted to ask the question was because much earlier in the day, we discussed the phrase hold to account. Now, on one view, a governance system would hold to account the person, group, individual, whatever it was, who was responsible for a problem arising. Is that not fair?
Yeah, it's fair.
Well, let's move on for the moment. We may come back to some of these topics. I've got some questions that I've been asked to put to you. But let's move on for the moment in your witness statement. We're on page 13, electronic page 13, and you then separated out a heading about ventilation concerns, and you say that you were first advised about the topic of air changes when you were briefed on the reasons why the adult BMT unit had been relocated back to the Beatson. And you say Mr. Calder would also refer to the situation in other parts of the hospital. What was he telling you?
Basically, the situation in the BMT had come about because the number of air changes wasn't to the standard that had been expected or was required, and that there might be other parts of the hospital where it was the same.
So, if that was so, would that not ring alarm bells, wave red flags, whatever metaphor you like, about air change rates way back in 2016?
No, it did. And we had the discussions at the board around whether these air change rates were causing risk to the patients, and if they were they being effectively managed?
When did you first, if ever, discover that the standard rooms in the hospital, not the specialist areas, the standard rooms in the hospital, had been built at half the air change rate recommended by Scottish Government?
I couldn't put a date on that.
Even roughly?
I would think it would be around 2017. I think by 2017 it was clear that there were a number of issues.
Oh, I understand that.
Water and ventilation. I can't today recollect which issue was raised at what point when I became aware of a specific one, unless there's a specific decision that was made at the board or a specific paper that came to the board that would help me.
I just wanted to ask you about that one because you're the chairman, you're used to moving in areas of governance, working with people at a high level. If somebody comes and says to you, we've just built this brand new flagship hospital at half the air changes rate that the Scottish Government would ask for, standard guidance for a standard single room, I think it might be suggested by some that would make you go, probably mutter a few expletives, no doubt under your breath, and then say, what the heck happened there?
No, my first response would be, what's the impact on the patients and what are we going to do to mitigate that?
Okay, after that, would you not want to know how that happened?
Yes.
And to use your reference earlier to the importance of risk assessment, would you want to know whether any decisions on that had been risk assessed?
Yes.
Did you find out?
Yes. the risk assessments for the construction work, the risk assessments were at project level and had been signed off through the governance of the programme.
Well,
But I did not go back and review the governance of the programme that delivered the hospital, or go back and review the risk registers around the project to come to a view on where the governance potentially, or the lack of governance potentially, might have caused the problem. I concentrated the board's energies and efforts and my own energies and efforts on resolving the situation. Very much we saw a role, as I said earlier, as we were trying to resolve the problems.
with the benefit of hindsight, do you think you should have tried to find out whether any decision taken on a topic of that, at least possible significance, certainly possible, the possibility of it being of concern to Scottish Government and others, had been, what steps had been gone through to reach that decision, how it had been processed, where the checks and balances were? And do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, you should have done more?
I think that it's necessary that that's done. I think it was at what point was that the best use of the resources and the time of the people that were available to deal with the situation. I think that there's been internal reviews, independent reviews, oversight boards, and we now have the public inquiry asking these questions. Had we asked those questions and come to answers earlier, would we still be having these conversations this number of years after it? I don't really know. But I do believe that at the time, the decisions that we made were in the interests of resolving the issues from the patient's perspective as quickly as possible. And that's where we put our time and our energy of the corporate management team, the time and the energy of the board. I'm not sure that knowing why and spending the time to understand why we made what decisions and so on would actually have helped us resolve the situation any quicker. If anything, I think it would have slowed things up.
Would have it allowed you to hold to account those involved?
It would have allowed us to identify those involved, and it would have allowed us to hold them to account better, yes. But as I say, the priority was resolving issues from the patient's perspective, not looking for accountability at that point.
When you were first told about the problems in different areas, were you told about possible problems in Ward 2A, the Schiehallion unit?
Yeah, I must have been told about that.
Because you say in paragraph 45 of your witness statement, immediately after your reference to talking to Mr. Calderwood in 2016, that the board was aware of the situation, was satisfied that any risks to patient safety had been identified and were being effectively managed. Now, given what we now know about what had to be done to Ward 2A, you can put any label you like on it, but very substantial works had to be carried out to produce something that people were satisfied with. How could you be satisfied in 2016 that matters were being properly looked after?
The board was advised of what the understanding of the problem was, and then what the response to it was. As they worked through the situation, it became clear that the initial identification of the problems and the mitigation of those problems wasn't resolving the situation. So there was more in-depth work done to identify what the problem was, and therefore more risk mitigation put in place, including the decant of the ward eventually. So it was a question of how quickly could they get to the bottom of it. But at each stage, the board was given a summary of what the problem was and details of what actions were being taken to resolve it. It wasn't always clear what the cause of the infections, for example, where it was coming from. And as each of the IMT decisions were made to mitigate what they thought was a potential cause, if that didn't work, they moved on. But from a governance point of view, the board was satisfied that the right people were looking at determining the problem and the right people were being asked to provide the solutions.
I wanted to ask you about it because the next paragraph of your witness statement, 47 on page 14, explains that there was a review of ventilation by Mr. Leeper in 2018. Now, we know there were other reviews in 2018 as well, particularly on Ward 2A. And one of the questions that parties have been keen to understand is, given that these reviews essentially discovered that this ward had not been built in the way the board had hoped it should have been built, it had been built more like a standard ward than one for specialist patients. Is it not surprising that with all your governance systems in place and your assurances, that you're now in 2018, years after the hospital's opened, that you're only now discovering this? Is that not a concern?
It is a concern. I accept that the time taken between problems arising and actually coming to a conclusion as to the cause of the problem and putting in the final solutions was far too long from anyone's perspective, particularly from the patients and their families' perspectives and from the perspective of the staff.
And I wanted to ask that because of your last answer, which is, I mean, you were told that the right people were doing the right things. And yet, in 2018, there were two reports, one from Mr. Leeper, one from, I think, a company called IDS, if I remember correctly, which basically go through 2A, like a knife through butter, saying wrong, 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 whole list of defects. Now, did that not immediately suggest to you as a governance expert that what you were being told was not correct or inadequate or too slow or something? And did you not do anything about it?
Well, I certainly felt it was inadequate. I certainly felt it was too slow.
Well, and what did you then do when you reached these conclusions?
Well, we looked to the executive team to actually put in more resources, to put in better governance and better reporting.
Okay, so, and you're looking to fix the physical problems. I understand that. Better reporting structures, but if you've just discovered that what you've been told is inadequate and too slow, as a governance expert, are you not wanting to hold somebody to account for that at the time? While it's all fresh, while the people aren't there, they haven't moved on. I just, you can understand why I'm having to ask you the questions. There may be others that we've asked similar questions to.
No, understand where your question's coming from, and I'm reflecting on what actually happened at the time and what the board's reaction at the time was. The board very much took the approach where if we had a problem which was a failure of information flows or a failure of governance, then we would look to improve the system and move forward on that basis. As far as holding an individual to account where the system was inadequate, then that would not have been appropriate because it was the system. If someone had followed the system and passed on the information through the right committee or through the right reporting mechanism, then certainly you wouldn't be holding an individual account. You would change the system. Where there had been a failure to apply the process or the systems, then the expectation would be that the management of those individuals would hold them to account.
I lost the opportunity just to confirm precisely what you meant, Professor. I've noted you as saying about 2 minutes ago, certainly felt it was inadequate and too slow. I just failed to follow what you meant by it.
Be the response.
The response. The response by subordinate management.
Within the executive team and within the management that was doing the problem identification and identification of the solutions and the implementation of the solutions.
Thank you.
So I'm still not quite following your answer, and the fault is perhaps mine. I understand if the system says fill up a form and the person fills up a form and nothing happens, that's a fault of the system. But if you've identified that the response to dealing with, say, Ward 2A was both inadequate and far too slow, perhaps those not familiar with healthcare administration would assume that somebody somewhere in that mix is responsible for it being inadequate and too slow, and that someone further up the tree can find out who that is and hold them to account. Now, am I wrong about that?
No,
And was that done?
I would say so, yes. I think there was some difficult conversations, I understand it, with individuals over the period.
I apologise for what seems to be repetitive questions, but a theme seems to be emerging that if you assume that you have a hierarchical structure that ends up going through the chief executive informally to you and formally to you and the board, it's not obvious what the board actually does other than focus on getting things fixed about the problems. I want to put to you another paragraph. In the next topic you deal with, paragraphs 48 onwards, is Schiehallion, and we've touched on Schiehallion as it happens already. Top of page 15, paragraph 51. My recollection is that the board members were surprised and disappointed. Well, I suspect many of us might suggest the next question is, so what did they do about it? Question mark. Because it's all very well to say, here we are, we're on a board that's just paid a lot of public money for a flagship hospital and we're disappointed. Well, and
we looked to the executive to give us the proposals on what it was that they were planning to do to resolve the situation that had arisen. And we scrutinised those proposals. They came to us.
did nobody say, how the heck did we end up in this situation?
I'm sure that question would have been asked.
Do you not remember?
No, I'm sure it would have been asked.
No, I mean, people quite often say in their witness statement something would have been done when what they actually mean is, I don't remember, that's just what the routine would have been.
Sorry, what I meant was the question was asked.
Right.
No.
And the answer was?
The answer was back on the construction of it hadn't been constructed to the standard that had been requested. And then that was the issue around the construction, the issue around the oversight of the construction by the advisors, and then the issue around the governance of the project by NHS GGC.
And you go on in paragraph 52 to point out that isolation rooms was also a topic that came up amongst the various topics of things that weren't satisfactory, but I won't take time asking you about that. Can I ask you about Ward 4C? Now, the inquiry has been told that the patient cohort originally intended to be in Ward 4B, which was then later designated for the BMT unit, were being moved into 4C. Did you see the clinical output specification for the original 4B?
No.
The reason I ask is it talks about immunocompromised patients and high degree of protection necessary. Were you aware of that?
I didn't see the specification.
Well, can I just ask the question again? Were you aware that that kind of patient was being accommodated in that ward?
I think so, yes.
Quite a simple reason. We have a problem here that we don't know the answer to. When the decision, and I'll explain this as a background to a question that relates to your period of time. When the decision was taken to move the BMT unit in, the proposed location was what we're now calling Ward 4B. And that had previously been scheduled, we are told by another witness, for a hemato-oncology ward moving from the Southern General. And a clinical output specification, which is part of the contractual documents, was prepared, which went on about the number of immunocompromised patients and the need for special protections and so on. Now, what we've not been able to find out is who then thought, oh, well, they're going to 4C. What do we do about 4C? That's an unresolved question. You're coming at this after the event, because you weren't there at the time of the construction decision. And you're saying that a very cautious approach to risk was being adopted by the board. Is that correct?
Yes.
If we go to page 16, we'll find where you say that. Now, one of the questions is, well, would that not involve finding out what the specification originally intended for that cohort of patients was, and ensuring, so far as possible, that that was reproduced in Ward 4C? Would you agree?
I would agree that action should be taken, but not by the NHS board. That would be a decision that would be taken within the management structure, within the programme board. That level of detail would not normally be decided at NHS board level. The allocation of specific patient cohorts to specific wards.
So when you talk in paragraph 56 of an extremely cautious approach to risk management at the NHS board level, is that relevant to the question I'm asking you, or nothing to do with it?
Our risk appetite for patient safety is very low at corporate level, which means that the expectation is then further down the organisation at operationalist level, it is also very low, and that risk appetite is applied by the people making those decisions.
Can I just ask you something about paragraph 56? The paragraph discusses some different views, and I want to ask you about that in a moment. But I wanted to ask you this, first of all, you've referred there to views about the number of air changes that should be in place. Were you aware that there was Scottish Government guidance on the number of air changes that should be in place in different wards?
Yes.
And were you aware that that guidance was the same guidance, broadly speaking, that applied throughout the UK?
Yes.
It's just that you talk about a debate about the relevance of air changes, but you don't mention the fact that, for right or wrong, the government of the UK have decided what the air changes should be. Is there any reason for that?
I think because the point that I'm referring to there is that where there was debate about patient impact of any aspect of the building, for example, and there was choices as to what approach was taken by the board would always look to have a low risk appetite for patient safety.
Who were the competing arguments being advanced by that you mentioned in paragraph 56? So if we could go back to page 16.
I think this was presented to the board as there were different opinions from different experts. I don't have a particular. Peter Hoffman was one name that I remember being quoted. As you say, there's the government guidance as well.
And where was these discussions happening? Can you help us at all?
They'd be happening at the committees who were looking at the issues as they were being discussed. The standing committees, so it'd either be the acute services or clinical governance, or perhaps finance performance, or even the audit and risk committee.
Do you remember when this was?
Not specifically a date, no. But these conversations were going on at the committees over a number of years around a number of different aspects of the building, around the impact that was having on the patients and what the resolution should be.
Yeah.
These conversations, these discussions, these decisions should be documented within the minutes of these committees and the minutes of the board over that period.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wanted to ask you is because of your reference to risk appetite. Because if one person says, well, I know the regulations say you should have X air changes, but my view is it doesn't matter. And another one says, well, that's what the regulations say, and I think it does matter. The low risk appetite would presumably then opt for the safer of the two options, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the next detail you come to is the what I mentioned earlier. Is we've just called the water incident, for want of a better word. And am I right in thinking that your evidence, as summarised in paragraph 59, was that the way that was responded to was in accordance with the low risk appetite of the board, as far as you were aware?
Yes.
Now, of course, one of the problems you were facing then, if I'm getting this correctly, is you're through in 2018. Some people have been suggesting there's a problem with the water for a lot longer than that. The DMA Canyon report may have emerged. Problems are being multiplied. Does it not suggest a further need for somebody to find out how you got into that water incident? And something that you should have been leading as chair?
Again, when it became clear that there was this water incident, we gave the knowledge about the 2015, the 2017 DMA Canyon report. The effort went into looking for a resolution to the problem, looking to define what the problem was. Who was responsible for what and when. That was an issue that came up as part of the updates, but it wasn't an issue that was taken out as a separate review or investigation. It was all part and parcel of the one thing.
Let me ask you about a completely different question, which does go to one of the issues that you dealt with in a question from me earlier. Page 17, paragraph 63. We agreed, I think earlier, that the relationship between chief executive and chair was important. Now, according to this paragraph, you were told by the chief executive that Dr. Inkster had resigned as lead infection control doctor in 2019 for personal reasons. And you've subsequently seen the resignation letter. And you say here, well, it's clear that that wasn't an accurate description. Now, what does that say to you about the relationship that you had at that time with the chief executive?
Well, it tells me that I wasn't fully informed.
It could tell you were misled, could it?
Yes.
Does that shed any other light on how effective your relationship was with Miss Grant?
I suppose it does bring into question whether I was fully informed or misled in other issues.
The next, perhaps not unconnected topic, we find at the top of page 18, where there's a reference to concerns expressed by Professor Gibson about hospital environment. Now, at points today, we've been talking about concerns expressed by microbiologists and so on and so forth. And we're aware that some members of management thought they were not accurate in their concerns, if I put it politely for the moment. Now, here you have Professor Gibson. Now, I take it you knew who Professor Gibson was.
Yes, I know Professor Gibson.
Certainly somebody who's been described in fairly glowing terms by lots of people, including parents of children. So what did you think when you were told that she and a bunch of clinicians were really unhappy about the systems that you were overseeing?
Well, obviously, I was concerned about it. As I said there, I was advised that it was being taken forward by the Chief Operating Officer. I visited Children's Hospital and had a conversation with Professor Gibson and I think 2 other consultants to speak to them and hear what their concerns were and to get the assurance that they felt they were being listened to and it was being addressed.
Does that communication suggest to you that whatever governance arrangements were in place prior to the letter had not been effective?
I'm not sure what governance arrangements that you're referring to from that letter, and that the concerns, as I understand it, that the consultants had was around the environment and the need to improve that environment more quickly than they understood that was being done. So that for me was more about the speed of response and the operational arrangements that were required to give the consultants staff, and most importantly, the patients and the families, the confidence that they were in a safe environment. So I'm not sure that's governance as such. But either way, whatever you want to call it, it was an issue that needed to be resolved and addressed to the satisfaction of the consultants and the staff that were working in the hospital.
I suppose maybe I'm misusing the term governance, but to an outsider to the system, it suggests something that's not quite right when a group of consultants basically have to write a pretty angry letter to the person at the top in the hope of getting action. It suggests whatever processes were in place were not functioning, at least in their view, adequately. Would you agree?
Oh, I would agree, yeah. Whether you call it governance or you call it management, I don't think's the issue. The issue is that it wasn't being resolved to their satisfaction quickly enough.
Now, can I ask you a topic about communications? And in particular, communications with Professor Cudahy. There's no issue over using Professor Cudahy's name. He's consented to that long ago. And you deal with this page, if we go to page 19 of your witness statement, I think it's fair to say Professor Cudahy wasn't very happy with what he saw as the treatment and circumstances of his child. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you were in touch with Professor Cudahy, is that right?
Yeah, Professor Cudahy got in touch through the Vice Chair with me, say that he would like to discuss the situation with his daughter, and I telephoned him initially, and he gave me the background, and I asked the Chief Executive, the Medical Director, to give me a briefing on it, and then I went back to Professor Cudahy and we did have a meeting with him.
Now, can we maybe just look at some documents in this context? We have bundle 6, page 53. Now, for reasons that I needn't go into, a lot of this has been redacted. Because the first thing you're doing here is apologising for delay. Is that right?
Yes.
So were you unhappy with the delay?
I was unhappy in principle with the delay because I recognised the level of concern, upset and distress that the Cudahy family were under. But the complexity of the case, Molly's condition, and the background to the decisions making around her treatment were such that it took time for the report to be brought together, is my understanding. And I would have rather that the report came later, but was accurate, than was rushed through.
Let's see what else we have on the publicly available document, page 54. Essentially, all you're dealing with on that page is responding in a broad sense to concerns about infection control generally that Professor Cudahy has raised with you. Is that right?
Yes.
55. Now, this is moving on now to, I think, a slightly different part of the saga, because there was a bit of an issue, to put it no higher, about Professor Cudahy not being told about another incident of the same unusual organism having been encountered. Now, rather than dot around the documents, I mean, were you aware that he should have been told about that and wasn't?
I was aware that he was unhappy at not being told about it because he had been told he would be told about these things after. He wasn't told. I wasn't aware that they put that in place. That arrangement was already in place. So I did know that Professor Cudahy was not happy that he hadn't been notified of something he was told that he would have been.
What I'm keen to understand is what your role in that was, because what seems to have happened is a decision was made he needed to be told. People would have gone to tell him, subject to all the usual constraints about what you can tell people about another person, but were stopped from doing that because it was said the chairman is going to deal with it.
Yeah, I was not aware that Professor Cudahy had been told he would be told about future infections, and at no point had I issued any instructions or advice to anyone that I would be dealing with Professor Cudahy. I dealt with Professor Cudahy's initial contact. I arranged for the meeting with him. I responded to any letters he sent directly to me, but I wasn't acting as the point of contact for Professor Cudahy at all. So why they decided that I would be dealing with it, I don't know.
Certainly, most of the others involved in the saga seem to think that you were this intended means of contact with Professor Cudahy. That comes as news to you, does it?
It certainly does. There was a point with the initial contact when I spoke to Professor Cudahy, met with Professor Cudahy, responded to his letters, but it was never my understanding or my instruction that I would be the person dealing directly with Professor Cudahy.
Can we just look at bundle 1 at page 330, please? I'm just looking to find the correct reference here. Can we just go on to the next page? Just trying to find the reference. And the next page, please. Now, finally, on to the next one. Sorry, this is an IMT minute. Now, you see under duty of candour, you know roughly what we're talking about in the context of duty of candour, I take it.
I do, yes.
Seems to have been intended by the IMT meeting that a duty of candour communication should take place with Professor Cudahy, because he's the father of the first case mentioned under that head. And it said the chairman is in communication with him. You're not aware of this?
Well, I hadn't seen those minutes because I don't receive the minutes of the IMT, but that communication presumably refers to the earlier contact with Professor Cudahy. If the interpretation of this is that Professor Gibson would speak to the most recent patient and I would speak to Professor Cudahy, no one passed that on to me.
The reason I wanted to ask is that meeting was on the 3rd of July. Part of the reason why this saga has created so much angst is that on the 4th of July, you wrote the letter we looked at, which, whatever it did, didn't mention the additional case. And that's, you say, because you didn't know you were meant to do that.
I didn't know I was meant to do it. I was not aware of the additional case. It wasn't part of the briefing or part of the draft letter to Professor Cuddihy. Otherwise, it would have been included in it.
And when you did write the next day, because this is the 3rd of July, your letter was the 4th, to Professor Cuddihy, who did you get briefing information from to assist you in preparing that letter?
I'd be the medical director and the chief executive.
So Dr. Armstrong and
Jane Grant.
Jane Grant. Were you then made aware that Professor Cuddihy was further angry about the fact that he hadn't been told?
I think Jane Grant told me that, yes.
And were you then involved in further communications with him?
Not that I remember.
Can we just look at bundle 6 at page 75, please? Now, this is not a letter from you, so be clear about that. This is a letter from Jane Grant. Were you involved in discussing what should be said to Professor Cuddihy in the context of this letter?
No.
We know the IMT was the 3rd of July, your letter was the 4th. We're now at the end of September, and this is the point at which more communication is taking place with Professor Cuddihy. Do you agree that that delay was unfortunate?
Well, certainly.
Now, the explanation given for the delay which is in the paragraph 3 up from the bottom, says that communication with you should wait until typing results of next child's bacteria are available, and also confidentiality with the second child. If the point was to tell Professor Cuddihy there had been another incident of the same mycobacterium, are these good reasons, in your view, for delay?
No, I would have expected them to tell Professor Cuddihy and also at the same time to tell him about the action that they were taking around the typing, and then to tell him what the result was after that.
Is there anything you think we could learn from this communication exchange, thinking about things that could have been done better?
I think that there is something in this communication, and I think it is a bit of a theme of waiting until all the information was available, or waiting until there was test results conclusive, a conclusive position achieved before contacting and giving information out. I think communications would have been better had we told people what we didn't know and when we would know it, rather than waiting until we knew things before contacting them. I don't think it was just this case. I think there's been other cases where we could have even said that there's been no change since the last time, but we are doing other work to find out.
Yeah, I think in fairness to you, if we go back to your witness statement at page 20, we see in paragraph 76, in fairness to you, you say, as far as quality of communication is concerned, I believe NHS GDC could have done better. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
In your answer a moment or two ago? Now, one of the points you raised was speed. Can I ask you about another one? It's been suggested in various quarters that the general approach of GGC Communications was what might be described as defensive. Would you agree with that?
I think it has been described as defensive. That's how people have reacted to it. I think this approach of trying to give a complete description of any situation, waiting until the full information was there, I think that hasn't helped with not only the turnaround, but also with how people have perceived the response. We have given out some very detailed responses with a lot of information in it, which have given the impression that we haven't accepted that the problem existed. I've always said to the communications team, to the management team, to the board, that the first thing we have to do is accept responsibility. We should then be apologising. We should then be explaining what we did to fix the current situation, and we should then explain what we're doing to ensure it doesn't happen again. Now, but I do recognise that the communications have been seen as being defensive on occasion.
I wanted to ask you, actually, I should have asked you a moment or two ago, can we go back to page 19, at the foot of the page, where you're talking about a meeting with Professor Cudahy, where obviously the medical director is also present. Now, I'm just looking at the way you've written this paragraph. The medical director explained the government's policy on the investigation of single cases of infection and the guidance on linking cases with the purposes of infection prevention and control. She confirmed that policy and guidance had been properly applied in Molly's case. Reading that as an outsider, not as a lawyer, or expert or anything else, I just wonder whether dealing with a potentially angry, potentially distraught, certainly upset patient, I better not use the word distraught, or Professor Cudahy will ring me up and tell me he wasn't distraught, but concerned patient, and saying, well, I can tell you we followed the proper procedures, might be regarded as a particularly unhelpful and not empathetic response. Would you agree?
From my recollection of it, Professor Cudahy was suggesting that other things should have happened, and the medical director explained what the policy, the process was, and how it had been applied in Molly's case. I don't think at any point was there any argument with Professor Cudahy that what he was suggesting would not have helped, because it would have certainly helped with his understanding of what happened and why it happened. So I think it's important that we should be following policy procedures, but it's also equally important, if these policies and procedures are not delivering the best possible outcomes for our patients, we should be looking to change them. But if it's considered defensive to say the policies and procedures have been followed, I would still argue that that's the starting point. Did you follow the procedures and the policies? The question then is, did those procedures and policies deliver the best outcome for the patient?
I wonder, with your permission, Lord, if I might just take a few minutes more to deal with some more communication questions while we're on this theme. I'm conscious of the time. Unless my Lord would prefer to break for lunch now.
I'm in your hands, Mr. Carr.
Perhaps I can just ask you a few more points about communications then, while we're here. I mean, you've accepted and you've set out on various pages that communications could have been better. And I think you would probably accept that when Professor White was first engaged, so before the Oversight Board, so he came in, he wasn't particularly happy with tone and content of a number of the communications and was concerned about that. You would agree?
Yes.
I just wonder if I can ask you one of the points that you've touched on in paragraph 80 on page 21, which is this, that we've had a lot of discussion about how communications were prepared. And one of the questions that we've sort of gone round the houses a bit on is, why do members of management have to see these? Sorry, why do members of management have to be involved in their content? Now, we were told, well, they need to approve them before they go out. They need to know they're going out. Well, second question, they need to know they're being issued. Fine. But the question is, why does a member of management, as opposed to a clinician or an IMT chair or whatever, need to be involved in that process? Because they should have no, on one view, they should have no substantive input into the content. Now, do you have any view on that?
I'm not quite sure I understand the situation that you're describing. I mean, the clinicians would obviously deal with the clinical issue with the patients direct with no management input. So,
But when
What
public statements
situation?
are being made or press releases or the like,
Your question, I mean, I'm not sure that your question was clear on that, although I did understand what you were talking about, were the preparation of press statements. Is that the context?
that's essentially the context, because I think the question that's been raised, and I'll put it as bluntly as I can to you, is that the only purpose, I'll put the suggestion, the only purpose of members of management, so not the comms people, not the clinicians, not the doctors, being involved in the content of communications, was to ensure that, as they saw it, the board's position, the board's approach, as they wanted it, was being presented. Do you recognise that situation?
I'm trying to understand what the alternative to senior management signing off communications that relate to the delivery of the services would be. Are you suggesting the communications director would do that? That's not the normal practice in the NHS
Well,
or the normal practice in
I'm
other
not
parts of the public sector.
I'm not concerned with what normal practice is. I'm concerned with what good practice might be. What I'm trying to get from you is this. I can understand.
Sorry, Mr. Connell. I think I understood that answer as being that what Professor Brown said was you would not recognise the involvement of management as necessarily in press statements as usual practice, or did I fail to pick you up?
No, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite,
It is
Or
usual
it's
practice.
the opposite. They always are.
Yeah, it was. I mean, the other parts of public sector I've worked in, press statements, media statements, and so on, certainly may well be written by the comms team, certainly informed by the professionals in the organisation, but normally there'd be some senior management oversight of them actually being issued.
I understood your answer.
And that applies across.
I understood your answer.
And of course, the situation changed with escalation.
I understand the escalation point, and I also understand your earlier answer. I think the question we've been trying to find our way around is accepting for the moment that a member of management needs to know that a communication is going out. They can't be blindsided because somebody's issued a press release that they don't know about. Leave that aside. One of the questions that arose, particularly over timing, was why a member of management should input into the substantive content of that press release, where it had been prepared by the professionals with assistance from the comms professionals. Because why are they chipping into it? What's the purpose of that?
I'm finding it hard to understand the circumstances where if the professional clinician, say, has written a statement, the comms people have ensured that it's presented in a way that's accessible and appropriate. The management would sign that off to ensure that there was a full response. I mean, in signing off any press statement or any response, the management role is fundamentally, firstly, to ensure that the question has been answered or the issue has been addressed. Well, and then it's to ensure that the answer is complete, accurate. I'm not sure when I can imagine a circumstance where a manager would rewrite and change. That's, I mean, I'm assuming you've got something in mind, a specific.
Well, I think what we had in mind was the question of timing largely, because what seemed to have been happening was that a number of communications went to someone in management and couldn't go out until management had reviewed them. Now, if management was simply saying, "Thank you for letting me know this is going out," tick, that wouldn't be necessary. If management weren't involved in the incidents which were giving rise to the communications, they would have no need to check them for completeness. And the suggestion being made by some is the only purpose of them looking at them is saying, we don't like the tone. It's not putting the board in a good light. It doesn't present the board's position in the way we would like to have it. Therefore, hang on till we change it. Do you recognise any of that as happening?
I can recognise what you're saying about tone, but not about content. I mean, you referenced Professor White and communications going through him and the occasions when he felt the tone, we discussed earlier, might have been defensive and changing some of the wording, but not changing the content. And I do agree with you, it does cause delay. Every time you put another step, it causes delay. I mean, as I said in my statement, that after the escalation, when
there was another level of delay.
Communications, there was another level added, and that did cause delays. And the more senior the person that's signing it off, the more likely there's delays because they have other demands on their time. Yeah, so I can see where you're coming from an efficiency point of view, but I'm not aware of it being introduced from changing content or ensuring that management, as you described it, management's views were somehow pushed through.
I think, my Lord, given the time, I should pause my questioning here and take the lunch adjournment, if that's acceptable.
We'll take our lunch break now, Professor. I'd ask you to be back for 2:10.
Certainly.
Stand.